You're not half the woman my mother-in-law is." The words hit me so hard my fingers slipped from the wine glass. The entire table went silent inside that expensive steakhouse in Cincinnati. My daughter Lauren sat beside her elegant mother-in-law, Diane Whitaker, with a smile on her face like she was proud of what she'd just done. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I kept staring at the child I had raised alone after burying her father. Then I slowly pushed my chair back. And that was the exact moment my daughter realized something in me had finally broken. If you've ever had someone you loved humiliate you in front of others, I want you to tell me in the comments. Would you have stayed at that table or walked away? And before we continue, please like and subscribe if stories like this touch your heart. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there tonight. My name is Kristin Kelly, and until 3 months ago, I believed there was nothing in this world stronger than the bond between a mother and her daughter. I don't believe that anymore. I'm 67 years old, retired widowed and living alone in the same modest brick house in Columbus, Ohio, where my husband Michael and I raised our daughter Lauren. The wallpaper in the hallway is older than some marriages. The kitchen cabinets still squeak the way they did in 1998. And every winter, cold air slips through the corner of the dining room window because Michael always insisted he would fix it next summer. There won't be another summer for him. Michael died 6 years ago after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. Even now, saying those words still feels unnatural. When people lose a spouse after 40 years of marriage, the world expects them to collapse all at once. But grief doesn't work that way. It arrives slowly, quietly. It sits beside you in grocery stores when you reach for 2 cans of soup instead of 1. It waits for you in empty parking lots after doctor appointments. It stares at you from the other side of the bed at 2 in the morning. And sometimes grief sounds exactly like your daughter saying another woman mattered more than you. But before all that happened, before Diane Whitaker entered our lives with her pearls and cold smiles and country club manners, Lauren and I used to be close. Very close. When Lauren was little, she followed me everywhere. If I folded laundry, she folded tiny washcloths beside me. If I baked cookies, she stood on a chair next to the oven wearing one of Michael's oversized aprons. She used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms and whisper, "Mom, you always make everything feel safe." I built my entire life around that child. I worked as a school librarian for 37 years. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly didn't make anyone rich, but I loved it. I loved watching shy children discover confidence through books. I loved helping lonely kids find stories that made them feel less alone. But librarians don't earn much money. So when Michael got sick during Lauren's sophomore year of college, everything changed overnight. The medical bills came fast. Radiation, chemotherapy, specialists, hospital stays, insurance deductibles. I remember sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a calculator trying to decide whether we could afford both Michael's medication and Lauren's tuition payment that month. Michael told me to let Lauren take student loans. I refused. She deserves a future, I told him. What I didn't tell him was that I had already started working weekends at a bookstore 40 minutes away just to keep the tuition checks coming. For nearly 2 years, I barely slept. I worked weekdays at the school library, weekends at the bookstore, and spent nights beside my husband's hospital bed pretending everything would be okay. Lauren never knew how bad things became financially. I made sure of that. I sold jewelry Michael had given me over the years. I canceled every luxury we had left. I learned how to stretch soup into 3 meals. Some months I paid the electric bill late just so Lauren wouldn't have to leave college embarrassed or afraid. And honestly, I would have done it all again, because that's what mothers do. Lauren graduated with honors from Ohio State University. The day she walked across that stage in her blue cap and gown, Michael cried harder than I did. He was already weak then. Thin, fragile. But he squeezed my hand and whispered, "We did it, Chris." That was one of the last truly happy days of my life. Michael died 8 months later. After the funeral, Lauren stayed close to me for a while. She came over every Sunday. She called almost every night. Sometimes she would sit at the kitchen table drinking tea while we talked about nothing important at all. Then she met Ryan Bennett. At first I liked him. Ryan was charming in the polished way ambitious men often are. He worked in commercial real estate in Cincinnati and wore expensive watches even before he could truly afford them. But he treated Lauren kindly in those early days, and after losing Michael, I desperately wanted my daughter to have happiness again. The changes happened slowly. So slowly, I almost missed them. Lauren started correcting the way I dressed. "You know, Mom, people wear more neutral colors now." Then it became my hair. "You'd look younger if you styled it differently." Then my home. "You should really update this place someday." At first I thought she was just trying to help me. Then came Diane Whitaker, Ryan's mother. The first time I met Diane was at an engagement dinner in Cincinnati. She arrived 20 minutes late wearing a cream-colored designer suit and enough diamonds to light the entire restaurant. Every person in the room seemed to straighten when she walked in. Diane had the kind of beauty that looked expensive. Perfect blonde hair, perfect nails, perfect posture, and perfect cruelty hidden beneath perfect manners. She hugged me lightly and immediately looked at my shoes. I still remember it. Not because she said anything, because she didn't have to. From that night on, Lauren slowly began changing around Diane. She laughed louder at Diane's jokes. She copied the way Diane spoke. She became embarrassed by ordinary things that used to make her feel proud, especially me. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself this was normal. Children grow up. Families change. New influences enter their lives. But deep down, I knew something else was happening. Lauren stopped inviting me to certain events. She would say things like, "It's mostly Ryan's business crowd, Mom. You'd probably be bored." Or Diane already handled the reservations. Or worse, "You wouldn't really fit in." That last one stayed with me for weeks. Still, I kept helping her. Even after Ryan and Lauren bought a house far beyond what they could comfortably afford. Even after Lauren started carrying designer handbags while complaining about financial stress. Every month, I quietly transferred money into their joint account. At first, it was small amounts. Then larger ones. Mortgage payments, emergency expenses, property taxes. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself families help each other. What Lauren never knew was that those payments came from me. Ryan knew, but Lauren didn't, and the cruelest part of all. By the time my daughter looked across that dinner table and told me I wasn't half the woman Diane Whitaker was, I had already spent 2 years secretly saving her from losing her home. The dinner took place on a Friday night in downtown Cincinnati, at a steakhouse so expensive I had looked up the menu online beforehand just to make sure I wouldn't embarrass myself by ordering the cheapest thing on it. That probably sounds ridiculous to some people. But when you spend most of your life clipping coupons and comparing grocery prices down to the cent, places like that don't feel luxurious. They feel dangerous. The restaurant sat inside a renovated historic building with dark wood walls, crystal chandeliers, and servers who spoke so softly I could barely hear them. The hostess smiled politely when I arrived, but I immediately noticed the way her eyes traveled over my department store coat before she led me toward the private dining room. Lauren barely looked up when I walked in. "Hey, Mom," she said quickly. No hug, no warmth, just 2 distracted words before she turned back toward Diane Whitaker. Diane was already seated at the center of the table like a queen holding court. Her silk emerald dress matched the expensive earrings sparkling beneath her blonde hair. Everything about her looked polished, controlled, intentional. Beside her sat Ryan in a navy suit checking something on his phone. 2 of Diane's country club friends were there too, along with Ryan's older brother and his wife. Everyone looked wealthy, or at least practiced at looking wealthy. Lauren stood to greet me eventually, but even then it felt rushed. Her perfume smelled expensive now, different from the vanilla lotion she used to wear when she was younger. "You made it," she said. Something about those words bothered me. Not, "I'm glad you're here." Not, "You look nice," just, "You made it." as if my attendance had been uncertain. I took the empty chair near the far end of the table while a waiter poured sparkling water into crystal glasses. Then the performance began, because that's what these dinners always were around Diane. Performances. Diane told long stories about a recent trip to Tuscany. Ryan's brother laughed too loudly at every joke she made. Lauren leaned toward Diane, constantly smiling with admiration I hadn't seen directed at me in years. At one point, Diane described hosting a charity gala at her country club. "You have to be careful with guest lists," she said lightly while sipping wine. "Certain people simply don't know how to behave in refined environments." Everyone chuckled politely. Everyone except me. Because Diane looked directly at me when she said it. Only for a second. But long enough. I lowered my eyes to my menu. I told myself not to react. That had become my specialty over the years. Not reacting. Not when Lauren corrected my grammar in front of people. Not when Diane asked whether librarians still existed in this digital age. Not when Ryan once joked that my little Columbus neighborhood felt surprisingly safe considering the property values. I swallowed every insult because I loved my daughter more than my pride. But something about that night felt different, sharper. Like everyone at the table knew something I didn't. The waiter brought appetizers. Diane ordered wine that cost more than my monthly electric bill. Lauren praised the selection immediately. "Oh, Diane always knows the best wines," she said. Diane smiled modestly. "Well, experience matters." Then she turned toward me. "Kristin, do you drink red wine? Or is that too strong for you?" The table went quiet for half a second. It was such a carefully crafted insult that anyone outside the conversation would have missed it completely. Too unsophisticated. Too small town. Too ordinary. I forced a smile. "I think I can manage." Lauren sighed softly beside me. That hurt more than Diane's comment. Because that sigh sounded embarrassed. Embarrassed of me. Dinner continued like that for nearly an hour. Every conversation somehow drifted back to Diane's accomplishments. Diane's taste. Diane's social circle. Diane's generosity. And every time I tried to contribute something, Lauren corrected me. "Actually, Mom, that's not the area they live in. Mom, it's pronounced differently. Mom, that restaurant closed years ago." Little things, tiny cuts. But enough tiny cuts can still make someone bleed. I kept thinking about Michael. If he had been alive, none of this would have happened. Michael never let anyone make me feel small. Not once in 40 years. Halfway through dinner, Diane began talking about family values. That woman loved the phrase family values, mostly because wealthy people often use it while behaving terribly. "I believe women shape families," Diane announced dramatically while the waiter cleared plates. "A strong woman creates success for everyone around her." Lauren nodded immediately. "Oh, absolutely." Diane dabbed her lips with a napkin before continuing. "You can always tell the quality of a family by the woman leading it." One of her friends smiled approvingly. Ryan stared down at his glass. And then Diane said the sentence that changed everything. "Some women simply know how to elevate the people around them." She looked directly at Lauren. Lauren laughed softly and reached for Diane's hand. Then my daughter turned toward me, and with the calmest voice imaginable, she said, "You're not half the woman my mother-in-law is." Silence. Complete silence. Even the clinking dishes from the restaurant outside the private room seemed to disappear. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. My chest tightened so suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. I stared at Lauren, waiting for her to laugh, waiting for her to say she was joking. But she didn't. She just sat there beside Diane Whitaker with the faintest smile on her face, as if she had finally said something she'd been thinking for years. I looked around the table. Nobody defended me. Not Ryan, not his brother, not anyone. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others looked uncomfortable, but relieved they weren't the target. And Diane leaned back slowly in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone watching a house burn after secretly pouring gasoline around it. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not exploded, shifted. People think heartbreak always arrives loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a door locking forever. I suddenly remembered 20-year-old Lauren crying in my arms after her first breakup. I remembered holding her hair when she was sick at 12. I remembered sitting beside her hospital bed after she broke her wrist in middle school. I remembered every Christmas, every bedtime story, every sacrifice. And I realized something devastating. The little girl who used to think I hung the moon was gone. Maybe she had been gone for years. My fingers loosened around my wine glass. Then slowly, very slowly, I pushed my chair back from the table. The sound echoed sharply against the wooden floor. Lauren's expression flickered for the first time. Confusion. Maybe even concern. "Mom?" I stood before she could finish. My knees felt weak, but my voice didn't. I looked directly at my daughter. Then I said the words that had been building inside me longer than I realized. "Then I'll stop trying to be your mother." Lauren's face went pale. Ryan looked up sharply. And for the first time all evening, Diane Whitaker stopped smiling. Nobody stopped me as I walked out of the private dining room. Not immediately. That hurt more than if someone had screamed. The heavy restaurant doors closed behind me, shutting out the soft music and polished laughter inside. The cold Ohio rain hit my face instantly, sharp enough to make me gasp. Downtown Cincinnati blurred beneath the streetlights, every passing car spraying water across the pavement. For a moment, I just stood there. My hands were shaking. Not dramatically, not the kind of shaking people notice in movies. Small tremors, the kind that happen when your body is trying to process something your heart still refuses to believe. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and walked toward the parking garage across the street. My heels clicked against the wet sidewalk while Lauren's words replayed inside my head over and over again. "You're not half the woman my mother-in-law is." I kept hearing her voice. Calm, certain, almost relieved. By the time I reached the garage entrance, my chest hurt so badly I had to stop walking for a second. I thought about Michael again. I always thought if our daughter ever truly broke my heart, he would somehow know. That sounds foolish at my age, doesn't it? But when you spend 40 years loving someone, you never fully stop talking to them in your head. "She didn't mean it," I whispered quietly into the rain. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. Lauren had meant every syllable. I reached into my purse for my car keys when I heard footsteps behind me. Kristin Ryan. I turned slowly. For one brief, humiliating second, relief washed over me. I thought maybe he had come to apologize. Maybe Lauren had finally realized what she'd done. Maybe Ryan was decent enough to say, "This went too far." He jogged toward me under the parking garage lights, his suit jacket damp from the rain. "Hey," he said breathlessly. "Wait a second." I stared at him without answering. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Lauren's upset." I almost laughed at that. Upset. What an interesting word choice. Not ashamed, not horrified. Upset. She should be, I said quietly. Ryan glanced toward the restaurant entrance before lowering his voice. "Look, tonight got emotional. Emotional. Another careful word. Not cruel, not unforgivable. Emotional." I folded my arms tightly against the cold. "What do you want, Ryan?" That's when his expression changed. Not softer, not kinder. Nervous. Like someone trying to approach a dangerous subject carefully. "Well," he hesitated. "I just wanted to make sure we're still okay for tomorrow." I frowned slightly. Tomorrow, the transfer. I blinked at him. For a second, I genuinely didn't understand what he meant. Then my stomach dropped. Ryan exhaled impatiently, clearly realizing too late that I wasn't following the conversation he thought we were having. "The wire transfer," he clarified. "For the mortgage situation." Rain dripped steadily from the concrete ceiling around us. Somewhere nearby, tires squealed against wet pavement. But suddenly all I could hear was my own pulse pounding in my ears. Ryan kept talking. We're kind of depending on it happening tomorrow. I stared at him. This man had just watched my daughter humiliate me in front of strangers. And this was why he followed me outside money. Not concern. Not remorse. Money. You came out here to ask me about money? I asked slowly. Ryan looked uncomfortable now. Well, it's just, timing matters. I took a step backward like I no longer recognized him. Did Lauren know you were coming out here? He hesitated again. Too long. That tiny hesitation told me everything. The dinner, the insults, the tension. It hadn't been spontaneous. Something ugly had been sitting underneath that entire evening. Ryan sighed heavily, clearly deciding honesty would help him more than lies. Kristin, please don't make this harder than it already is. Harder. I almost laughed again. My voice came out colder than I intended. What exactly is this, Ryan? He rubbed water from his forehead. The house situation. There it was again. The house. Not family, not feelings. The house. I felt suddenly exhausted. What situation? Ryan looked genuinely surprised. You mean Lauren never told you? No. He cursed quietly under his breath. Then he looked around the empty garage before speaking lower. We're behind. How far behind? Ryan swallowed. 4 months. The number hit me like ice water. 4 months. Their mortgage alone was more than my yearly property taxes. How I whispered. Ryan gave a humorless laugh. Lifestyle catches up with people. That answer told me more than he realized. The designer furniture, the vacations, the luxury SUV Lauren suddenly drove, the endless social events with Diane Whitaker's circle. Appearances. They had built an entire life around appearances. And Diane? I asked carefully. Ryan's jaw tightened immediately. That reaction alone told me I was finally asking the correct questions. She's trying to help, he muttered. I stared at him. No, I said quietly. She's trying to control. Ryan didn't answer. Rain hammered the garage entrance harder now. Finally, he sighed heavily again. She thought maybe if Lauren pushed you a little tonight. The rest of the sentence died unfinished between us. But I heard it anyway. If Lauren pushed you hard enough, you'd feel guilty. You'd hand over the money. You'd keep saving them. A terrible silence settled over me. Not because I was shocked anymore. Because suddenly everything made sense. The expensive dinner. Diane's constant insults. Lauren's cruelty. They had been preparing me emotionally. Breaking me down. Making me desperate for approval. And then afterward, they would ask for help. I looked at Ryan carefully. Did my daughter agree to this? His eyes dropped. That was answer enough. Something inside me cracked then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like old wood finally splitting after years of pressure. I thought about every sacrifice I had made for Lauren, every overtime shift, every sleepless night, every dollar quietly transferred into their account while I wore the same winter coat for 9 years, because replacing it felt unnecessary. And standing there in that cold parking garage, I realized something horrifying. My daughter no longer saw my love, only my usefulness. Ryan stepped closer carefully. Kristin, we just need a little more time. I looked at him with complete disbelief. You think this conversation is about money? We're desperate. No, I said softly. You're greedy. His face hardened immediately. There it was. The real Ryan. Not charming, not polished, entitled. You don't understand the pressure we're under, he snapped quietly. I stared at him for several seconds. Then I asked the question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Did Lauren mean what she said tonight? Ryan opened his mouth, closed it again, and in that silence, I got my answer. I nodded slowly. Then I walked past him toward my car. Kristin. I stopped without turning around. The transfer isn't coming tomorrow, I said. Ryan's voice sharpened instantly. What I finally looked back at him, and for the first time in years, I think he truly saw me clearly. Not as Lauren's quiet mother, not as emergency money, not as someone easy to manipulate. Just a woman who had finally reached the end of her suffering. "I'm done paying for people who despise me," I said. Then I got into my car and locked the doors while Ryan stood frozen in the rain. And as I drove home alone through the dark Ohio highway, one terrifying thought kept repeating inside my head. If my daughter could do this for money, what else was she capable of? I got home a little after midnight. The rain had followed me all the way from Cincinnati to Columbus, drumming against the windshield for nearly 2 hours while I drove in complete silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I barely even noticed the highway signs passing in the darkness. I just kept replaying the night in my head. Lauren's voice, Ryan's expression, Diane smiling while my daughter tore me apart. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the porch light had turned itself off automatically. The little brick house sat quietly beneath the storm clouds, looking smaller than usual somehow. Lonelier. I stayed inside the car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. This house used to feel warm, safe. Now it felt like a museum filled with memories of people who no longer existed. Eventually, I forced myself out into the cold and walked up the front steps. My knees ached worse these days when it rained. Michael used to joke that our bodies became weather stations after 60. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent hit me immediately. Old books, coffee, lavender furniture polish, home. I closed the door gently behind me and leaned against it. The silence inside the house felt heavy tonight. Not peaceful, heavy. For years after Michael died, I slept with the television on because complete silence made grief louder somehow. Eventually, I learned how to live with the quiet. But this silence was different. This silence carried humiliation inside it. I removed my wet coat carefully and hung it beside Michael's old brown jacket that still remained untouched near the door. 6 years, and I still couldn't move it. My eyes drifted toward the hallway mirror. I looked tired, older than 67. The woman staring back at me looked nothing like Diane Whitaker. No elegant silk dresses, no expensive jewelry, no polished perfection. Just soft gray hair falling loose around a tired face lined with years of worry and sacrifice. And suddenly Lauren's words came rushing back again. "You're not half the woman my mother-in-law is." Before I realized it, tears filled my eyes. Not loud crying, just exhausted tears slipping quietly down my face. I pressed my hand against my mouth because somehow that sentence hurt even more here at home than it had inside the restaurant. Because inside this house, every wall carried proof of how much I had loved my daughter. I walked slowly into the kitchen and turned on the small light above the stove. The yellow glow illuminated the old wooden table where Michael and I had spent decades paying bills, helping Lauren with homework, and planning futures we believed would always include each other. My chest tightened painfully. Then something unexpected happened. I got angry. Not explosive anger, not screaming anger, cold anger, the kind that arrives after heartbreak burns itself out. Because suddenly I realized something that made me physically sick. Lauren had no idea what it had cost to love her this much. None. She had grown up protected from every ugly truth. And I had allowed that. I walked down the hallway toward the spare bedroom Michael once used as a small office. After his death, I had converted it into storage because I couldn't bear seeing his empty chair every day. Inside the closet sat a narrow metal filing cabinet. Locked. I hadn't opened it in almost a year. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Then I reached into the top shelf and pulled down the small ceramic bowl where I kept important keys. My hands hesitated slightly before unlocking the bottom drawer. The metal squealed softly as it opened. And there it was. My entire adult life reduced to folders and paperwork. Tuition receipts, medical bills, mortgage statements, insurance forms, bank transfers, sacrifices. I sat down slowly on the carpeted floor beside the cabinet and began pulling files out one by one. Here was Lauren's college tuition from sophomore year. Paid 3 days after Michael's second chemotherapy treatment. Here were the loan documents from the small home equity line I took out to keep Lauren from drowning in student debt. Here were receipts from the jewelry store where I sold 2 diamond bracelets Michael gave me during our 20th anniversary. I still remembered handing those bracelets across the glass counter while pretending I wasn't embarrassed. And there, my throat tightened. A pharmacy receipt. 3 years ago. The date immediately hit me. That had been during the winter I started experiencing chest pains. I remembered the doctor recommending additional cardiac testing. I also remembered canceling it after Ryan called panicking about being short on mortgage money. I had sent them nearly $4,000 that month instead, and I never rescheduled my tests. I closed my eyes. What had I done to myself? What had I allowed these people to turn me into? A woman slowly disappearing to keep others comfortable. Tears blurred my vision again as I reached deeper into the cabinet. At the very back sat an old white envelope in Michael's handwriting. My breath caught instantly. I recognized it immediately. I hadn't opened it since shortly after his funeral. The paper felt fragile as I slid the letter out carefully. Chris, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone, and you're probably trying to carry the entire world alone again. That first sentence alone nearly broke me. Michael knew me too well. I kept reading. You have the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But it also scares me, because people who love deeply often get used by people who love conditionally. I stared at those words for a long time, then continued. Lauren is a good person, but grief, money, and insecurity change people sometimes. Promise me something. Don't spend the rest of your life setting yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm. And please remember, this being needed is not the same thing as being loved. My hands started shaking again, because suddenly it felt like Michael was sitting beside me in that tiny room, seeing everything I had refused to see myself. There was one final line at the bottom of the letter. If the day ever comes when someone makes you choose between your dignity and their approval, choose your dignity. I pressed the letter against my chest and cried harder than I had in years. Not only for Michael, for myself, for the woman I used to be before grief and loneliness and motherhood blurred together into endless sacrifice. Eventually, the tears stopped. The house became quiet again. I wiped my face slowly and looked around the room. The filing cabinet remained open beside me, exposing years of financial records. Proof. That word suddenly settled heavily inside my mind. Proof. Not memories, not emotions, facts. For the first time since leaving the restaurant, my thoughts became clear. Very clear. Ryan thought the transfer was still coming tomorrow. Lauren probably assumed I would calm down overnight. Diane likely believed humiliation would make me easier to manipulate. None of them understood something important. They had finally pushed me past guilt. And once guilt disappears, fear usually follows. I carefully placed Michael's letter beside me on the floor. Then I began organizing every document into neat stacks. Bank transfers, mortgage payments, financial records, every hidden sacrifice. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the woman who had walked out of that restaurant no longer existed. And for the first time in years, I was no longer preparing to save my daughter. I was preparing to protect myself. Lauren called the next morning at exactly 9:12 a.m. I remember the time because I had barely slept. After organizing the financial records until nearly dawn, I finally drifted off on the living room couch with Michael's letter still resting on my chest. I woke up stiff, exhausted, and emotionally hollow. The phone vibrating against the coffee table startled me awake. For a moment, I simply stared at Lauren's name flashing across the screen. 3 years ago, seeing my daughter call used to make me smile instantly. Now it filled me with dread. I answered anyway. Hello, Lauren. Exhaled sharply like she was already irritated. Mom, why didn't you answer your texts? I blinked slowly. Not, are you okay? Not, I'm sorry. Not even, can we talk? Just annoyance. I looked toward the window where soft rain still streaked the glass. I haven't checked my phone. Well, Ryan said you canceled the transfer. Straight to business again. My stomach tightened. Yes. Silence. Then another heavy exhale. Mom, can we not do this right now? That sentence almost fascinated me, as if I had created the conflict, as if humiliating your mother publicly was a small misunderstanding she hoped to skip over. I'm not the one doing something, Lauren, I said quietly. You know what I mean. No, I replied. Actually, I don't. She went silent for a second. Then her voice softened slightly in the artificial way people speak when trying to manage someone emotionally. Look, last night got out of hand. Out of hand. Again, no apology, no ownership, just vague language floating around the truth without touching it. You said exactly what you wanted to say, I answered. That's not fair. I almost laughed at that. Fair. The irony nearly took my breath away. Before I could respond, Lauren continued quickly. Listen, Diane invited everyone for brunch today. She wants to smooth things over. There it was. Diane. Always Diane. I closed my eyes briefly. What time Lauren sounded relieved immediately, which told me she had expected resistance. 1:00. And if I say no? Another pause. Then carefully, Mom. Don't make things harder. The exact same phrase Ryan had used the night before. Something cold settled deeper inside me. They spoke like people following the same script. I glanced toward the filing cabinet still partially open in the hallway. Michael's words echoed quietly inside my mind. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved. I'll come, I said finally. Lauren sounded surprised. Really? Yes. Good. Her tone brightened instantly. Good. Diane really just wants everyone together. No, I thought silently. Diane wants control. But I didn't say it aloud. Instead, I simply ended the call after a few more strained sentences and sat quietly for several minutes afterward. Every instinct inside me said not to go. But another part of me, the part slowly waking up after years of denial, needed to see these people clearly, not emotionally, not as family, clearly. At noon, I drove to Cincinnati again. The weather had improved slightly, though thick gray clouds still covered the sky. Traffic moved slowly along the interstate, while I gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The closer I got to Diane Whitaker's neighborhood, the more unreal my life felt. Massive gated homes lined perfectly manicured streets. Decorative fountains stood in front yards larger than public parks. Everything looked polished enough for magazine covers. Diane's mansion sat near the end of a quiet cul-de-sac behind black iron gates. Mansion really was the only word for it. White stone exterior, tall columns, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of house built specifically to impress strangers. A valet opened my car door before I could even protest. I suddenly felt painfully aware of my sensible shoes and old handbag. Inside the house smelled like fresh flowers and expensive candles. Soft piano music floated through hidden speakers while guests wandered through enormous rooms carrying champagne glasses before noon. Lauren hurried toward me immediately. Mom, you came. Her expression looked tense, nervous. Not guilty, just nervous. I noticed she hugged me quickly while glancing over my shoulder, almost checking whether anyone was watching. You look tired, she whispered. I didn't sleep much. Her eyes shifted away. Interesting. Somewhere deep down, she knew exactly why. Diane appeared moments later wearing cream-colored slacks and a pearl necklace that probably cost more than my car. Kristin, she said warmly, air-kissing near my cheek. I'm so glad you came. Families shouldn't stay upset with each other. The performance had begun already. I looked directly into her eyes. There was nothing warm there, only calculation. You're very kind to invite me, I replied carefully. Diane smiled wider. Clearly pleased I was playing along. Lauren was devastated after last night. Devastated. Again, not remorseful, not ashamed. Devastated, as though my reaction had been the tragedy. Brunch took place in a glass dining room overlooking an enormous backyard garden. White roses climbed stone walls while servers carried trays of pastries and mimosas between guests. Everything looked beautiful, artificially beautiful, like one strong storm could destroy it all. I spent most of the afternoon quietly observing. That's what years as a librarian taught me best. People reveal themselves when they think no one important is listening. Diane controlled every conversation effortlessly. She interrupted people smoothly, corrected stories subtly, redirected attention toward herself constantly, and everyone allowed it, especially Lauren. I watched my daughter laugh too loudly at Diane's jokes. I watched her straighten her posture whenever Diane entered the room. I watched her seek approval like sunlight. It made me heartsick. At one point, Ryan approached me near the buffet table. He looked uncomfortable. "We should talk later," he muttered quietly. "About," his jaw tightened slightly. "You know about. Money again. Always money." Before I could answer, Diane called loudly from across the room. "Ryan, darling, come help me with the wine selection." Not request. Command. Ryan obeyed instantly. That fascinated me too, because for the first time I noticed something beneath Ryan's polished confidence. Fear. Around 3 o'clock, I excused myself to use the restroom upstairs. Truthfully, I just needed air. The entire house felt emotionally suffocating. As I walked down the long upstairs hallway, I heard voices drifting from a partially open sitting room nearby. Diane's voice. Sharp. Mocking. I slowed instinctively. "She still dresses like she shops at pharmacy clearance racks," Diane said. Several women laughed softly. Another voice asked, "Do you think she suspects anything?" Diane scoffed. "Please. Kristin Kelly practically apologizes for existing." More laughter. My chest tightened. Then Diane said the sentence that finally shattered any remaining illusion I had about her. "She's basically an old wallet with emotions." The women burst into louder laughter. I froze. Completely froze. For a moment, I honestly thought I might be sick. Wallet, not mother, not family. Wallet. Every humiliation, every manipulation, every fake smile. Suddenly it all made horrifying sense. Diane never tolerated me. She tolerated access to me. I stood motionless outside that doorway while my heart pounded violently in my chest. Then another woman asked carefully, "Does Lauren know you talk about her mother like this?" Diane laughed lightly. "Oh, Lauren only sees what benefits her now." The cruelty of that sentence nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. Not because it came from Diane, because deep down, I feared she might be right. A floorboard creaked softly beneath my foot. The room went silent instantly. I turned and walked away before anyone opened the door. But as I descended the staircase slowly back toward the brunch downstairs, one truth had become painfully clear. Diane Whitaker had never seen me as family, only as a resource. And somehow, my daughter had allowed it. I should have left immediately after hearing Diane call me an old wallet with emotions. A healthier woman probably would have. A stronger woman definitely would have. But heartbreak does strange things to people. Sometimes instead of running from pain, you stay close to it hoping you somehow misunderstood what you heard. So I went back downstairs. I sat through another 40 minutes of fake laughter, sparkling glasses, and carefully performed politeness while something inside me slowly turned to stone. Lauren noticed the change in me almost immediately. Mothers know their children's faces instinctively, but children often forget mothers have the same ability. She kept glancing at me during conversations. Her smile looked tighter now, less natural, like she sensed something had shifted but couldn't identify what. Good, I thought quietly. For once, let her feel uncertain. Around 4 o'clock, many of the guests finally began leaving. Air kisses, designer handbags, promises to do lunch soon. I stood near the grand staircase waiting for my coat when Diane approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might like something warm before the drive home," she said sweetly. I accepted the cup carefully. "Thank you." Her eyes studied my face closely, trying to read me, trying to determine whether I had overheard the conversation upstairs. I gave her nothing. Years of surviving grief had taught me how to hide pain very well. Lauren joined us moments later, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself. "Mom, before you leave, can we sit for a minute?" she asked. My stomach tightened instantly. "Here it comes." Diane smiled warmly. "Oh yes, we wanted to discuss something exciting." Exciting. That word alone warned me this conversation was dangerous. Still, I followed them into a smaller sitting room near the back of the house. The room overlooked the garden and smelled faintly like expensive perfume and fresh roses. Ryan was already waiting inside. He stood when I entered but avoided eye contact. Another warning. I sat slowly in an armchair while Diane remained standing near the fireplace like a politician preparing a speech. Lauren perched nervously beside Ryan on the sofa. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then Diane clasped her hands elegantly. "We've been talking a lot lately about family legacy," she began. There it was again. That woman loved dressing manipulation in beautiful language. I remained silent. Diane continued smoothly. "As families grow, it becomes important to think long-term. Assets, traditions, shared spaces." Ryan stared at the floor. Lauren nodded encouragingly toward Diane like an obedient student. And suddenly I knew exactly where this conversation was heading before a single direct word had been spoken. The cabin. Michael's cabin. The small lakeside cabin in northern Michigan that my husband spent nearly 12 summers building with his own hands. My chest tightened instantly. Diane smiled wider. "Lauren tells me your lake property has been in the family for years." I looked directly at my daughter. "You've been discussing my property?" Lauren shifted slightly. "Mom, not like that. Not like that." Interesting response. Diane sat gracefully across from me. "We simply believe families should enjoy meaningful places together." There it was. Careful, polished, predatory. I set my coffee cup down slowly. That cabin already belongs to family. Ryan finally spoke quietly. "That's not what Diane means." "Of course not. Because people like Diane never considered someone truly family unless they controlled them." Lauren leaned forward eagerly now. "Mom, you barely even use the cabin anymore." I stared at her. "Barely use it? Michael's ashes were scattered beside that lake. I visited every summer, sometimes twice." "You haven't been there in almost a year," Lauren continued. "Your father built that cabin," I said softly. Lauren sighed immediately. The sigh again. Always that sigh whenever emotions inconvenienced her. "We know, Mom. But things change. Things change." I wondered if she had any idea how cruel that sentence sounded. Diane crossed one elegant leg over the other. "What Lauren means is that properties like that should stay active and beneficial for younger generations." Younger generations. Translation us. I suddenly remembered overhearing Diane upstairs. Wallet. Not mother. Wallet. Everything became crystal clear now. This brunch had not been about peace. It had been another negotiation. Another attempt to secure access to something they wanted. The cabin wasn't just property to them. It was waterfront land worth nearly $1 million now. And because Michael and I bought it decades earlier, they assumed an elderly widow would eventually hand it over out of guilt or loneliness. Lauren's voice softened artificially. "Mom imagined future grandchildren spending summers there." Ah. There it was. Emotional leverage. The future grandchildren card. Classic manipulation. I folded my hands carefully in my lap to stop myself from visibly reacting. "That cabin isn't a vacation property," I said quietly. "It's part of your father's memory." Ryan rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Nobody's trying to disrespect Michael." "No, because this entire conversation felt like grave robbing." Diane leaned toward me slightly. "Of course not. But surely Michael would have wanted the family to evolve." Evolve. What a beautiful word for taking something that doesn't belong to you. Lauren reached for my hand suddenly. "Mom, we're not asking for anything crazy." My heart twisted painfully at how sincerely she seemed to believe that. That's the terrifying thing about manipulation. Eventually, people stop recognizing it. What exactly are you asking for? I said calmly. Lauren exchanged a quick glance with Ryan. Then Diane answered for her. We thought it might make sense to transfer the cabin into a shared family trust. There it was. Finally. No more pretending. No more vague language. Transfer ownership. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Oddly enough, hearing the truth out loud made me calmer. Because now I fully understood what I was dealing with. I looked at Lauren carefully. Was this your idea? She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw something heartbreaking. Confusion. Like she genuinely no longer knew where Diane's desires ended and her own began. We all talked about it, she said finally. All. Interesting word. I nodded slowly. Then I asked the question none of them expected. What happens if I say no? Silence filled the room instantly. Ryan looked uncomfortable. Lauren's face tightened. And Diane smiled. But this time the warmth disappeared completely. Well, she said lightly, that would certainly be disappointing. There it was. The threat beneath the manners. I suddenly saw her clearly for the first time. Not sophisticated, not elegant, just a bully, wrapped in expensive fabric. My grief disappeared completely in that moment. In its place came clarity. Calm, terrifying clarity. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Then I spoke the sentence that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. The cabin cannot be transferred. Lauren frowned immediately. What do you mean it's legally protected? Diane's expression flickered for the first time. Barely. But enough. I continued calmly. Michael and I placed the property into a protected trust years ago. Ryan looked up sharply. Lauren blinked in confusion. You never told me that. No, I replied quietly. I didn't. Diane recovered quickly. Well, trusts can always be adjusted. Not this one. That answer landed heavily. Lauren's voice sharpened slightly. Mom, why would you do that without telling me? Because your father understood people better than I did, I thought. Instead, I said, because your father wanted the cabin preserved exactly as it is. Lauren stood suddenly. So that's it. You're just shutting us out. The irony nearly made me dizzy. After everything they had done, somehow, I was still the villain. I looked up at my daughter calmly. No, Lauren, I said softly. I'm protecting what your father built. Diane's jaw tightened almost invisibly. And for the first time since entering that house, I realized something important. They truly believed I was weak, which meant they were completely unprepared for what would happen once I stopped acting like it. The room changed after I mentioned the trust. Not dramatically, not loudly. But the energy shifted so fast, it almost felt physical. A few minutes earlier, Diane Whitaker had been relaxed, elegant, completely in control. Lauren had sounded emotional, but confident. Ryan had looked nervous, though still hopeful this conversation would eventually go their way. Now all three of them looked unsettled. And that told me something important. The cabin mattered far more than they had admitted. Lauren crossed her arms tightly over her chest. So you just made this decision without ever talking to me, she demanded. I looked at her carefully. You weren't entitled to that decision. Her face flushed immediately. The old version of me would have softened after seeing that expression. I would have apologized for sounding harsh. I would have tried to comfort her, but the old version of me was disappearing. Diane stepped in smoothly before Lauren could respond. Kristin, surely we can discuss options like adults. There it was again. That condescending tone disguised as sophistication. I stood slowly from my chair. There's nothing to discuss. Ryan finally spoke up. Kristin, please don't do this. I looked directly at him. Do what punish everyone because emotions got heated. Punish. Interesting word. Not protect myself. Not establish boundaries. Punish. I suddenly realized something chilling. None of them believed my feelings were real. To them, I was simply reacting emotionally instead of finally seeing the truth. Lauren shook her head in frustration. "You're acting completely different." "Yes," I said quietly. "I am." That answer landed harder than yelling would have. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Lauren laughed bitterly. "You know what, fine? Keep the cabin. Keep all of it." Her voice cracked slightly at the end. Not from heartbreak, from anger. "I don't understand why you're suddenly being so selfish." Selfish. The word hit me so hard, I actually stared at her in disbelief. Selfish. I thought about the years I spent skipping vacations to help her financially, the jewelry I sold, the medical appointments I postponed, the retirement savings I drained quietly, so she could maintain a lifestyle she could not afford. And now my daughter was calling me selfish because I refused to surrender my dead husband's cabin. Something inside me hardened permanently in that moment. I looked directly at Lauren. "Do you know who paid your mortgage last December?" Her expression changed instantly. Confusion replaced anger for a second. "What?" I repeated the question calmly. "Do you know who paid your mortgage last December?" Ryan went pale immediately. Lauren turned toward him slowly. "What is she talking about?" Ryan opened his mouth but didn't answer. That silence spoke volumes. My heart pounded heavily now, but my voice remained steady. "What about March?" I continued. "Or August? Or the property taxes in September?" Lauren stared at me, then at Ryan, then back at me. "No," she whispered. "No," Diane said. I know exactly what Diane said. Diane stood immediately. "This conversation is becoming inappropriate." I ignored her completely. "For 2 years," I said softly, "I've been helping you keep that house." Lauren blinked repeatedly like her brain refused to process the words. "That's not possible." I almost felt sorry for her then. Almost. Because I could actually see the moment reality began cracking open around her. "Ryan?" she asked quietly. He rubbed both hands over his face. "Lauren, no." Her voice sharpened instantly. "Tell me she's lying." Ryan didn't answer quickly enough. That was all it took. Lauren stepped backward like she'd been physically struck. Oh my God. Tears filled her eyes immediately. Not tears for me. Not yet. Tears born from humiliation. Because suddenly she realized she had been standing in judgment over the very person secretly holding her life together. "You told me your firm bonus covered everything," she whispered to Ryan. Ryan looked exhausted. It was complicated. Complicated? Lauren's voice rose sharply. "You let me believe I was trying to protect you." The room exploded into overlapping voices after that. Lauren demanded answers. Ryan tried defending himself. Diane repeatedly interrupted. And through all of it, I stood there silently watching something terrible unfold. The illusion. That beautiful, expensive illusion Lauren had built her identity around was collapsing in real time. Finally, Lauren turned toward Diane desperately. You knew Diane's face remained composed, but barely. "Lauren, sweetheart, you knew my mother was paying our bills." Diane hesitated. Wrong move. That hesitation answered everything. Lauren looked like she might actually be sick. "You told me Mom was emotionally manipulating us with money," she whispered. Diane straightened immediately. "Well, in many ways she was." I stared at her in disbelief. Even now. Even cornered. That woman still couldn't stop manipulating. Ryan stepped between them slightly. "Diane, stop." "No," Diane snapped sharply. "Someone needs to be honest here." Her polished mask was finally slipping. "You two overspent. Constantly. Someone had to stabilize the situation." Lauren looked horrified. "You used my mother?" Diane laughed coldly. "Oh, please." Kristin enjoyed feeling needed. The cruelty of that sentence stunned even Ryan. "Mom," he muttered quietly. But Diane kept going. "Your mother-in-law gave money willingly because it made her feel important. That's how women like Kristin operate. Women like Kristin. Ordinary women. Older women. Women Diane considered beneath her. Something inside Lauren visibly cracked then. "But you told me she judged us," Lauren whispered. Diane rolled her eyes impatiently. "She does judge you. All mothers do." "No," I said quietly. Everyone turned toward me. I looked directly at my daughter. "I worried about you," I said softly. "There's a difference." Lauren's eyes filled instantly. Real tears this time. Painful ones. I could see memories moving behind her expression now. Tiny moments suddenly rearranging themselves into new meaning. The unexplained bank deposits. Ryan's vague excuses. My repeated offers to help temporarily. All the things she never questioned because Diane gave her a more comfortable version of reality. Ryan sat heavily on the edge of the sofa. "I didn't want you to know how bad things were," he admitted quietly. Lauren stared at him. "So instead, you let me humiliate my mother." That sentence finally silenced the room. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, Lauren sounded ashamed. Ryan looked miserable. "I thought if you knew the money came from her, you'd feel guilty." "You mean human," Lauren snapped. Diane stepped forward again immediately. "Lauren, emotions are clouding your judgment." "No," Lauren whispered. Then she looked at me. And the expression on her face nearly broke my heart despite everything. Confusion, guilt, fear, the face of someone realizing they had become a person they no longer recognized. "How much?" she asked quietly. I should have lied. Part of me wanted to protect her from the truth one last time. But lies were the reason we ended up here, so I answered honestly. "Enough to keep your house." Lauren covered her mouth with shaking fingers. Ryan stared at the floor, and Diane looked furious. Not guilty, not embarrassed, furious, because control was slipping away from her. I suddenly understood something very clearly. This woman never expected the truth to surface. She believed secrecy would keep everyone dependent and divided forever. But secrets rarely stay buried once people stop fearing them. Lauren sank slowly into the sofa, staring blankly ahead. Then finally, in a small, shattered voice, she asked the question I had been waiting for. "Why didn't you tell me I looked at my daughter for a very long time before answering?" "Because I loved you more than I loved being appreciated." The silence afterward felt enormous. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Lauren couldn't look Diane Whitaker in the eyes. I left Diane Whitaker's mansion before anyone could stop me. Lauren called after me once as I walked toward the front door. "Mom, wait." But I didn't stop. Not because I hated her, because I finally understood something painful. If I stayed in that house 1 minute longer, I would start comforting the very people who had broken me. And I was tired of bleeding just to keep everyone else comfortable. The valet brought my car around while cold winds swept through the driveway. Gray clouds hung low above the enormous homes surrounding Diane's neighborhood, making everything look dimmer now somehow. Less impressive. As I drove away, my phone rang 3 times. Lauren, then Ryan, then Lauren again. I ignored all of them. For years, I answered every call immediately because some part of me feared that if I stopped being available, I would stop being loved. Now I understood the terrible truth. People who only love your usefulness panic when access disappears. By the time I reached Columbus, my exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. But beneath it was something else too. Clarity. Cold, uncomfortable clarity. I pulled into my driveway, walked inside, and went directly to the kitchen table where the stacks of financial records still waited from the night before. For several minutes, I simply stared at them. Then I picked up the phone and called the one person Michael trusted more than anyone outside our family. Turner and Blake Law Offices. "Hello," I said quietly. "May I speak with Abigail Turner?" There was a brief pause. "One moment, please." A few seconds later, a warm, familiar voice came through the line. "Kristin." For the first time in 2 days, my chest loosened slightly. Abigail Turner had been Michael's attorney for nearly 20 years. After Michael died, she handled his estate paperwork and helped me establish several legal protections regarding the cabin and other remaining assets. She was sharp, calm, and impossible to intimidate. Michael adored her. "Hi, Abby," I said softly. Something in my voice must have alarmed her immediately. "What happened?" And just like that, I started crying. Not dramatically, not uncontrollably, just quiet tears slipping out while years of buried humiliation finally surfaced all at once. Abigail listened without interrupting while I explained everything. The dinner, Lauren's cruelty, Ryan asking about money in the parking garage, Diane manipulating everyone, the cabin conversation, the secret mortgage payments finally exposed. When I finished, the line stayed silent for several seconds. Then Abigail sighed heavily. "Kristin," she said carefully, "I need you to listen to me very closely." I wiped my eyes. "Okay, you are being financially targeted." The bluntness of that sentence stunned me. Targeted. Not misunderstood. Not pressured. Targeted. Abigail continued calmly. "What Diane Whitaker is doing follows a very common pattern. Emotional dependency. Financial guilt. Gradual asset access. Escalating entitlement." My stomach tightened. Hearing it described so clinically made the situation feel even uglier somehow. "I just thought I was helping my daughter." "I know," Abigail said gently. "That's why this works on good people." I closed my eyes. Good people. Michael used to say kindness without boundaries becomes self-destruction. At the time, I thought he was being cynical. Now I realized he had simply been wiser than I was. Abigail's voice sharpened slightly. "Have you transferred any ownership of assets recently?" "No." "Good. Any shared account access? Number excellent." I frowned slightly. "You sound relieved." "I am relieved," she replied immediately. "Because honestly, Kristin, I've been worried for a while." That startled me. "What do you mean?" There was a pause. Then Abigail spoke more carefully. "Michael contacted me privately about 6 months before he died." My heart stopped. What he wanted, additional legal protections added around the cabin and several investment accounts. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "He thought this would happen?" "Not specifically," Abigail said gently, "but he was worried Lauren might eventually fall under someone's influence." Tears burned my eyes again instantly. Even dying Michael had still been trying to protect me. Abigail continued. "Kristin, I think it's time we review everything." Everything. The word felt enormous, terrifying, necessary. We scheduled a meeting for the next morning. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the evening going through every financial document in the house. Retirement accounts, mortgage records, insurance policies, tax returns. The deeper I looked, the more ashamed I became. Not because I had helped Lauren, because I had hidden how much I was sacrificing to do it. I had quietly drained portions of my retirement savings, postponed home repairs, reduced medical spending, all while Lauren posted photos from luxury restaurants online beside captions about gratitude and building a beautiful life, a life partially funded by the woman she publicly humiliated. Around 8 that evening, my phone buzzed again. Lauren. This time there was a voicemail. I stared at it for several seconds before finally pressing play. "Mom." Her voice sounded shaky. "Please call me back. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Silence followed for a moment. Then quietly, "Diane said you wanted to help because you felt lonely after Dad died." My throat tightened painfully. Of course she did. That explanation painted me as emotionally unstable while making Diane appear practical and sophisticated. Manipulation wrapped in concern. Lauren's voice cracked again. "Ryan admitted everything after you left. Mom, there's more debt than I realized." I leaned back slowly in my chair. More debt. How much more? The voicemail continued. Please talk to me." Then it ended. I didn't call back. Not because I wanted revenge, because I genuinely didn't know who my daughter was anymore. The next morning I drove downtown to Abigail Turner's law office. Unlike Diane's mansion, Abigail's office felt solid rather than flashy. Dark wood bookshelves lined the walls. Framed degrees hung neatly behind her desk. The building smelled faintly like coffee and paper instead of perfume and expensive candles. Real. That was the word. Everything here felt real. Abigail greeted me with a long hug the moment I entered her office. "You look exhausted." "I am." She guided me into a chair before placing a thick folder on the desk between us. "What's that?" I asked. "Everything Michael asked me to prepare before he passed." My chest tightened instantly. Abigail opened the folder carefully. Inside were trust documents, property protections, financial directives, letters. Michael had prepared for possibilities I refused to imagine. Abigail adjusted her glasses. "Your husband was a very intelligent man." "Yes," I whispered. "He was." She slid several papers toward me. "The cabin is fully protected. They cannot touch it." Relief flooded through me so suddenly I almost cried again. But Abigail continued carefully. "I'm more concerned about your remaining liquid assets." I frowned. "What do you mean I did some research last night?" That sentence immediately made my stomach tighten. "Research on who?" Abigail looked directly at me. "Diane Whitaker." The room suddenly felt colder, and Abigail opened another file. "She's in financial trouble." My pulse quickened instantly. How bad? Abigail exhaled slowly. "Worse than most people realize." Then she turned the file toward me. "Credit debt, refinancing records, second mortgages, outstanding lawsuits connected to investment losses." I stared at the pages in shock. "But she lives in a mansion." Abigail gave me a grim smile. "So do many bankrupt people." I looked down at the paperwork again. Suddenly everything clicked into place with horrifying precision. The pressure, the manipulation, the obsession with the cabin, the attempts to isolate Lauren emotionally from me. Diane Whitaker wasn't simply controlling. She was desperate, and desperate people become dangerous. Abigail folded her hands carefully on the desk. "Kristin, I need you to understand something very important." I looked up slowly. "You are no longer dealing with family tension," she said quietly. "You are dealing with people who see your assets as solutions to their problems." The room fell silent after that, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I finally understood exactly how serious this had become. 3 days after my meeting with Abigail Turner, I received the document that changed everything. It arrived by certified mail just before noon. I remember because I had been standing in the kitchen making tomato soup when the doorbell rang. The weather outside had turned bitterly cold again, gray clouds hanging low over Columbus, while sharp wind rattled the old dining room window Michael never got the chance to repair. The mail carrier handed me a thick envelope. "Need your signature, ma'am." Something about the official-looking paperwork instantly made my stomach tighten. I signed for it, slowly closed the front door, and stood there staring at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. Then my entire body went cold. Petition for temporary financial guardianship. I read the words 3 times before my brain fully processed them. Guardian, financial instability, questionable decision-making, concerns regarding cognitive decline. My hands started shaking so violently the papers nearly slipped from my fingers. Lauren's name appeared halfway down the page. So did Ryan's. And underneath their signatures, Diane Whitaker. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. I sank slowly into the nearest kitchen chair while the soup boiled forgotten on the stove behind me. This wasn't pressure anymore. This wasn't manipulation. This was war. The petition claimed I had become emotionally unstable after my husband's death. It argued that my recent irrational hostility and sudden financial secrecy suggested diminished mental competence. I actually laughed when I read that part. A sharp, broken laugh that barely sounded human. Financial secrecy. After secretly funding their lives for 2 years. My eyes scanned further down the document. There it was. The real reason. Concerns regarding preservation of family assets. Assets. Always assets. The cabin, my retirement accounts, Michael's investments, everything. They were trying to legally position themselves between me and my own life. I pressed my fingers against my forehead, while rage unlike anything I had ever experienced surged through my chest. Not because of Diane. I expected cruelty from her now. Because Lauren signed it. My daughter signed papers suggesting I was mentally incompetent. Tears blurred my vision instantly. I thought about every bedtime story, every fever I stayed awake through, every sacrifice. And now she wanted legal control over me. The humiliation of it burned deeper than I can describe. Not old enough to be respected, just old enough to be managed. The soup began boiling over loudly behind me, jerking me back to reality. I turned off the stove mechanically before grabbing my phone and calling Abigail. She answered immediately. "Kristin, they filed guardianship paperwork," I whispered. Silence, then a very calm, "Send me photos immediately." I snapped pictures of every page with trembling hands and texted them over. Abigail called back less than 5 minutes later. Her voice sounded colder than I had ever heard it before. "This is aggressive." I swallowed hard. "Can they do this?" "They can try." Try. The word offered little comfort. Abigail continued carefully. "But Kristin, listened to me very closely. This petition is weak. Weak." It didn't feel weak. It felt devastating. "They're relying on emotional narratives," Abigail explained. "Not medical evidence." I closed my eyes. "They're saying I'm unstable, and we're going to prove you aren't." Her confidence steadied me slightly. Then she asked the question I had been dreading. "Did Lauren contact you before filing this no?" Another silence. "That's important," Abigail said quietly. "Important." I knew what she meant. A loving daughter concerned about cognitive decline usually attempts conversations first. This wasn't concern. It was strategy. Abigail instructed me to come into her office immediately. I barely remember the drive downtown. My mind kept replaying the document over and over again. Questionable judgment, emotional instability, potential financial mismanagement. I spent 40 years building a reputation as a dependable, responsible woman. Now my own child was trying to paint me as confused and incapable because I stopped funding her life. By the time I reached Abigail's office, I felt physically ill. She greeted me with a tight expression and several neatly organized folders spread across her desk. "Sit," she said gently. I obeyed automatically. Abigail adjusted her glasses before speaking. "I anticipated something like this." That startled me. "You did?" She nodded. "Once you cut financial access, escalation became likely." Escalation. Again, her legal language made everything sound terrifyingly clinical. Abigail opened one folder. Fortunately, Michael anticipated it too. My throat tightened instantly. She slid several documents toward me. Medical evaluations, financial competency reviews, signed legal certifications, dates spanning the last several years. I frowned in confusion. What is all this protective preparation? I stared at her. Abigail leaned back carefully. "After Michael became ill, he worried about two things leaving you alone and leaving you vulnerable." Tears filled my eyes immediately. Even dying Michael had still been protecting me. Abigail pointed toward the evaluations. "Over the last 4 years, you've completed annual competency reviews connected to trust management." Remember, I blinked? Yes, barely. At the time, it had simply felt like routine legal maintenance. I never understood the deeper purpose. "You're medically documented as fully competent," Abigail continued. "Your financial management history is excellent. There's no evidence supporting emergency guardianship." Relief washed through me so powerfully, I nearly cried. But beneath it came something darker. Anger. Because Lauren and Ryan either knew these protections existed, or they filed anyway without even checking. Both possibilities hurt. Abigail opened another file. "I also contacted your physician this morning." I looked up sharply. "You did?" "Yes." Dr. Wallace is prepared to provide formal testimony if necessary. Dr. Wallace had been my doctor for nearly 15 years. The idea of needing testimony about my own sanity made me feel ancient suddenly, fragile, humiliated. Abigail must have noticed the change in my expression. "This is what people like Diane count on," she said softly. "What shame." I looked at her quietly. "They hope older people will become emotionally overwhelmed and surrender instead of fighting back." My chest tightened painfully, because that was exactly what had almost happened. If Abigail hadn't prepared everything, if Michael hadn't thought ahead, I might have panicked. I might have surrendered just to make the nightmare stop. Abigail folded her hands together. "But now we need to think strategically." The word strategically sounded strange applied to my own family. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said carefully, "that we stop reacting emotionally and start documenting everything. Everything. Every text, every voicemail, every financial record, every conversation." I nodded slowly, then quietly asked the question haunting me most. "Do you think Lauren understands what she's doing?" Abigail hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than any answer. Finally, she sighed. "I think Lauren is emotionally compromised." Emotionally compromised. Such a polite phrase for manipulation. But then Abigail said something that stayed with me. "However, Kristin, manipulation explains behavior. It does not erase responsibility." I looked down at the guardianship petition again. Lauren's signature stared back at me from the bottom of the page. Neat, certain, permanent. My daughter had signed paperwork asking strangers to question my competence. I suddenly remembered teaching Lauren how to sign her name in kindergarten. The memory nearly destroyed me. Abigail's voice softened. "You don't have to decide today whether you forgive her." I looked up slowly. "But you do need to decide whether you'll protect yourself." The answer came easier than I expected. "Yes," I whispered. "Not because I stopped loving my daughter. Because I finally started loving myself too." Abigail nodded once. "Good." Then she slid a yellow legal pad across the desk toward me. At the top, she had written 3 words: "Build your case." I stared at the phrase quietly. Case. Not family disagreement, not misunderstanding. Case. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I fully accepted the truth. The people trying to take control of my life were no longer simply hurting me. They were preparing to erase me. The family meeting happened 4 days later. By then, the guardianship petition had already poisoned whatever fragile hope remained between us. Lauren texted constantly during those 4 days. At first, the messages sounded defensive. "Mom, this isn't what you think." Diane said this was temporary. "We were trying to protect everyone." Then came guilt. "Please don't shut me out. I made mistakes. Can we just talk privately?" Then finally fear. "Mom, Diane's getting angry. Ryan and I are overwhelmed. Please answer me. I read every message." I answered none of them. Because Abigail had been right. For the first time in my life, I needed to stop reacting emotionally and start paying attention to behavior. And behavior tells the truth long before words do. The meeting itself was Abigail's idea. "Bring them onto your ground," she told me. "People reveal themselves differently when they lose environmental control." So instead of another restaurant or another room inside Diane Whitaker's mansion, we scheduled the conversation at my house in Columbus. The small brick house Diane once mocked silently with her eyes. The same house where Lauren learned to walk. The same house where Michael died holding my hand. That mattered to me. I spent the entire morning cleaning even though everything was already clean. Trauma does strange things to people. Sometimes when life becomes emotionally uncontrollable, you start wiping kitchen counters just to feel capable of fixing something. By noon, the house smelled like lemon polish and coffee. Michael's framed photo still sat beside the fireplace. I almost moved it, then decided not to. He belonged there. At exactly 1:07 p.m., a black SUV pulled into my driveway. I watched from the front window as Lauren stepped out first. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes. No makeup. No designer confidence. Ryan followed behind her, looking tense and pale. And then Diane emerged from the passenger side, wearing a camel-colored coat and sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. Even arriving at a family confrontation, she still dressed for performance. Abigail was already seated at my dining room table when the doorbell rang. Calm, organized, prepared. Seeing her there gave me strength I didn't realize I needed. "You ready?" she asked quietly. "No." But I nodded anyway. When I opened the front door, Lauren's eyes filled with tears instantly. "Mom." I stepped aside silently. No hug. No comforting smile. Just distance. All three entered slowly. Diane glanced around my home with carefully disguised discomfort. I suddenly realized she had never actually spent meaningful time here before. That hurt more than expected. Because once upon a time, Lauren used to call this place home with pride. Now it looked like foreign territory to all of them. Ryan noticed Abigail immediately. His face tightened. "What's this?" Abigail stood politely. "Abigail Turner, Kristin's attorney." The atmosphere changed instantly. Lauren looked startled. Diane looked irritated. Only Ryan looked nervous. Interesting. We sat around the dining room table awkwardly. The same table where Lauren used to color pictures while Michael cooked pancakes on Saturday mornings. The memories almost crushed me. Diane folded her hands elegantly. "Well," she began smoothly, "I think we all agree emotions have escalated unnecessarily." Abigail didn't even blink. Attempting financial guardianship against a mentally competent adult is more than emotional escalation. Diane's expression hardened slightly. It was filed out of concern. "No," Abigail replied calmly. "It was filed after Kristin stopped providing financial access." Silence. Sharp. Immediate. Lauren looked down at the table. Ryan rubbed his jaw anxiously. Diane remained composed, but I noticed her fingers tightening around her purse strap. Good. For once, let her feel pressure. Lauren finally spoke softly. "Mom." I didn't understand how serious this looked. I stared at my daughter for several seconds before answering. "You signed legal documents claiming I was mentally unstable." Tears welled instantly in her eyes. "I know." "No," I said quietly. "I don't think you do." That landed hard. Lauren covered her mouth briefly. Ryan leaned forward suddenly. "Kristin, this got out of control fast." I'm sure Diane thought many things," Abigail interrupted calmly. Diane's eyes flashed immediately. "With all due respect, no," Abigail said. "Respectfully, you attempted to gain legal influence over a widow's estate through unsupported competency claims." The room froze, because for the first time someone had finally said it plainly. Not misunderstanding. Not concern. Influence over an estate. Diane sat straighter immediately. "That's an outrageous accusation." Abigail opened a folder slowly. "I have your financial disclosures." For the first time since I met her, Diane Whitaker looked genuinely alarmed. Just for a second. But I saw it. Ryan saw it too. Lauren frowned in confusion. "What financial disclosures?" Abigail slid several papers across the table. Bank records, refinancing documents, debt filings. The color drained slowly from Lauren's face as she read. "Diane?" Diane recovered quickly. "My private finances are irrelevant." "No," Abigail replied calmly. "They establish motive." Motive. God. Hearing family discussions reduced to legal language felt surreal. Lauren looked up shakily. "You said the investment issues were temporary." "They are temporary," Diane snapped. Abigail slid another document forward. "A third mortgage on your property suggests otherwise." Ryan swore quietly under his breath. I stared at Diane in disbelief. Third mortgage. The mansion wasn't wealth. It was debt-wearing makeup. Lauren looked physically sick now. You told us everything was stable. Diane's polished mask cracked further. I protected this family. No, Ryan said suddenly. You controlled everyone. The room went silent again. That was the first time Ryan had openly challenged his mother. Diane turned toward him slowly. Excuse me, Ryan looked exhausted. You pushed us constantly. Bigger house, better image, better social circles. You benefited from all of it. Ryan laughed bitterly. We're drowning. Lauren's breathing became uneven beside him. I watched my daughter carefully as realizations spread across her face piece by piece. The luxury vacations, the social climbing, the constant pressure to appear successful. It had never been about happiness, only appearances. And appearances are expensive. Abigail opened another folder. Kristin also has recordings. Every head turned instantly. Even mine. Recordings. Abigail looked toward me briefly. The brunch conversation. Understanding hit me immediately. My phone. I had accidentally activated the voice memo feature after overhearing Diane upstairs at the mansion. I completely forgot about it afterward until Abigail discovered the file while organizing evidence. Diane's expression changed instantly. Sharp. Dangerous. What recordings? Abigail pressed a button on her tablet. And suddenly Diane's voice filled my dining room. She's basically an old wallet with emotions. Silence crashed into the room. Lauren went completely still. Ryan closed his eyes. Then another voice asked, Does Lauren know you talk about her mother like this? And Diane answered, Lauren only sees what benefits her now. The recording ended. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I looked at Lauren slowly. The devastation on her face almost broke me despite everything. Because now she finally heard it herself. Not filtered. Not softened. Raw truth. Diane straightened coldly. That conversation was taken out of context. No, Ryan whispered. It really wasn't. Lauren stared at Diane with trembling lips. You mocked my mother. Diane scoffed impatiently. Oh, please. Kristin has manipulated all of you with guilt for years. That sentence changed something permanently inside Lauren. I saw it happen. Not anger. Not confusion. Recognition. Like she was finally seeing Diane clearly for the first time. You made me believe my mother was weak, Lauren whispered. Diane rolled her eyes. She is weak. That's why this happened. No, I said quietly. Everyone turned toward me. Then slowly, calmly, I looked directly at Diane Whitaker. The weak person in this room is the one who mistakes cruelty for strength. Silence. Absolute silence. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Diane Whitaker had no immediate response. The silence after my words felt almost unnatural. Even the old clock in the hallway suddenly sounded louder. Tick, tick, tick. Diane Whitaker sat perfectly still across from me, but the mask she had worn for years was finally slipping badly now. The elegant composure remained on the surface, yet underneath it, I could see something raw for the first time. Panic. Good. Because for years, panic belonged only to me. The panic of unpaid bills. The panic of hiding sacrifices. The panic of losing my daughter emotionally piece by piece while pretending everything was fine. Now it was Diane's turn. Lauren stared at her mother-in-law like she was seeing a stranger. I defended you, she whispered. Diane exhaled sharply through her nose. Oh, Lauren, don't be dramatic. That sentence alone changed everything. Because it wasn't comforting. It wasn't apologetic. It was annoyed. Like Lauren's heartbreak had become inconvenient. Ryan leaned forward slowly, elbows resting on his knees. Maybe you should stop talking, he muttered quietly to Diane. She turned toward him instantly. Excuse me. You're making this worse. Diane laughed once. Cold. Sharp. Worse, she repeated. You think I caused this? Ryan looked exhausted beyond words. I think you pushed everyone until they broke. Something flickered across Diane's face then. Not guilt. Contempt. You two would still be living in a starter home if it weren't for me. Lauren flinched visibly. And suddenly, I understood something painful. Diane had not simply manipulated my daughter financially. She had trained her emotionally. Every compliment conditional. Every kindness transactional. Every moment of approval tied to status, appearance, or obedience. Love with strings attached eventually teaches people to perform instead of feel. Lauren's voice trembled. You told me my mother held me back. Diane shrugged carelessly. She did. The cruelty of her honesty stunned the room. Even Abigail looked momentarily surprised. I watched Lauren carefully as those words settled into her chest like broken glass. My mother loved me, Lauren whispered. Diane's expression hardened instantly. Love doesn't pay bills. There it was. The real Diane Whitaker. Not polished, not sophisticated, just emotionally empty. The sentence hit Lauren harder than anything else had so far. Because finally, she understood the difference between Diane and me. I gave until it hurt because I loved her. Diane gave only when it bought loyalty. Ryan stood abruptly and walked toward the kitchen window, running both hands through his hair. We should never have filed the petition. Diane scoffed immediately. Oh, stop acting morally superior now. Ryan turned around sharply. She's not incompetent. You said yourself she was becoming irrational. I said she was upset. You said she was isolating herself because her daughter humiliated her. The room exploded again. Lauren covered her face with both hands. Abigail remained silent, carefully observing everyone like a chess player, watching pieces reposition themselves. And me, I sat completely still. Because strangely enough, I no longer felt confused, only sad. Terribly, deeply sad. For years I thought Diane Whitaker stole my daughter from me. But sitting there watching everything unravel, I realized the truth was more complicated. Lauren gave pieces of herself away willingly because Diane offered her something intoxicating. Validation, status, the illusion of importance. And once someone becomes addicted to external approval, they stop recognizing genuine love because genuine love doesn't always flatter you. Sometimes it sacrifices quietly instead. Lauren slowly lowered her hands. Tears streamed openly down her face now. You made me ashamed of her, she whispered to Diane. Diane looked almost bored. No. I encouraged you to improve yourself. The arrogance of that sentence stunned even me. Lauren shook her head slowly. She worked herself sick helping us. Diane crossed her arms, and she chose to do that. I finally spoke again. Yes, I said quietly. I did. Everyone looked toward me. I met Lauren's eyes carefully, and that was my mistake. Lauren's face crumpled instantly. Mom. For years I taught you that my love would survive anything, any disrespect, any sacrifice, any humiliation. My voice shook slightly now despite my efforts. I kept giving because I thought love meant endless forgiveness. Tears slid down Lauren's cheeks faster. Ryan stared at the floor. Even Abigail's expression softened slightly. But Diane looked irritated. Actually, irritated. Like emotional honesty bored her. You're all behaving like victims, she snapped suddenly. That sentence changed the atmosphere immediately. Ryan looked up slowly. Diane stood from her chair sharply. I am tired of this performance. Everyone here benefited from ambition, from standards, from connections. She pointed toward Lauren. You loved the vacations. Toward Ryan. You loved the business introductions. Then toward me. And you loved being needed. I stood slowly. No, I said softly. I loved my daughter. For the first time all afternoon, Diane lost control completely. Oh, please, she snapped loudly. If you truly loved her, you would have prepared her for reality instead of filling her head with sentimental nonsense. Lauren physically recoiled. You don't get to talk about my mother like that anymore. The room went still. because that was the first time Lauren had openly defended me in years. Diane stared at her in disbelief. Lauren stood too now, trembling badly. You made me believe kindness was weakness. Diane's voice sharpened dangerously. Careful. That one word carried years of emotional conditioning inside it. Careful. Stay obedient. Stay grateful. Stay useful. But something had broken inside Lauren finally. No, she whispered. I'm done being careful. Diane looked toward Ryan immediately. Say something. Ryan laughed bitterly. For once, I think she's right. The color drained from Diane's face. Not because they challenged her, because control was slipping away permanently. And controlling people cannot tolerate losing authority. She grabbed her purse aggressively. You're all making catastrophic mistakes. Abigail finally spoke again. No, she said calmly. The catastrophic mistake was attempting legal coercion against a competent widow. Diane glared at her. This family would collapse without me. And there it was. The truth. Not love. Control. Need. Dependency. That's what Diane actually wanted. She needed people financially and emotionally tied to her because underneath all the designer clothes and polished confidence lived a terrified woman drowning in debt and desperate to maintain appearances. For the first time, I almost pitied her. Almost. Then I remembered the guardianship papers, the manipulation, the humiliation, the calculated cruelty, and the pity disappeared. Lauren wiped her face shakily. Was any of it real? She asked quietly. Diane looked genuinely confused. What? The way you treated me. The way you said I was like family. A long silence followed. Then Diane answered with brutal honesty. You were family. Lauren looked hopeful for half a second. Then Diane finished the sentence. You just stopped being useful. The entire room froze. Ryan closed his eyes immediately. Abigail slowly set down her pen. And my daughter, my beautiful little girl who once believed love made people safe, looked like her heart had shattered right there in my dining room. Tears poured silently down her face, while she stared at Diane in disbelief. Then finally, in a voice so small it barely sounded like her, Lauren whispered, My mother warned me about people like you when I was little. Diane scoffed coldly. And yet, here you are. No, Lauren said quietly. Then she looked at me. And for the first time in years, I saw my daughter clearly again. Not the social climbing woman Diane created, not the embarrassed daughter from the restaurant. Just Lauren, broken, ashamed, awake. After Diane left my house, nobody moved for a very long time. The front door slammed hard enough to shake the hallway picture frames, and then silence settled over the room like dust after a collapse. Ryan remained standing near the kitchen window, staring outside blankly. Abigail quietly gathered several documents into neat stacks, giving the rest of us space to breathe. And Lauren sat across from me, looking completely destroyed. Not dramatic, not theatrical, destroyed. The kind of destruction that happens when someone finally sees themselves honestly after years of running from the truth. Her mascara had streaked beneath her eyes. Her hands shook in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, without Diane's approval surrounding her like armor. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then finally, Ryan exhaled heavily. I should go. Lauren looked up slowly. What? He rubbed his forehead tiredly. I think you and your mom need to talk. There was guilt all over his face now. Real guilt, not polished excuses. But I noticed something important too. He still wasn't apologizing fully. People often mistake regret for accountability. They are not the same thing. Lauren nodded weakly. Ryan hesitated before looking toward me. Kristin, I am sorry. I studied him quietly. For which part? He swallowed hard. That question clearly hurt. Good. Because apologies without specifics are often just attempts to escape discomfort. Ryan looked down, for letting things go too far. Too far. Again with the vague language. Not for using me, Not for hiding the mortgage payments, not for participating in the guardianship petition, just too far. I gave a small nod anyway. Not forgiveness, acknowledgement. Ryan understood the difference immediately. A few minutes later, he left quietly. Abigail stood afterward and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. I'll file the response paperwork tomorrow morning. Thank you. She glanced briefly toward Lauren, then back at me. You don't owe anyone immediate reconciliation. I knew exactly why she said it. Because people like me women, raised to nurture comfort and absorb pain, often rush toward forgiveness before healing even begins. I squeezed her hand softly. I know. And surprisingly, I meant it. After Abigail left, the house became painfully quiet. Lauren and I sat across from each other at the dining room table, where so much of our lives had unfolded over decades. Birthday cakes, homework assignments, Christmas wrapping paper, hospital bills. Now this. My daughter wiped her face shakily. I don't even know where to start. Neither did I. So instead of speaking immediately, I stood and walked into the kitchen. Do you still take tea with honey? I asked quietly. Lauren looked startled. Yes, simple things survive even after relationships fracture. I made tea mechanically while she sat silently behind me. The familiar routine steadied my hands slightly. Water boiling, tea bags steeping, spoons clinking against ceramic mugs. Motherhood lives inside muscle memory, even after heartbreak. When I returned to the table and placed the mug in front of her, Lauren burst into tears again. Not loud tears, the exhausted kind. I don't deserve you, she whispered. I sat down slowly across from her. No, I said honestly. You don't deserve what I gave you. The truth landed heavily between us. Lauren nodded through tears. I know. For a long moment, she simply stared down into her tea. Then quietly, when Dad got sick, were things really that bad financially? I leaned back slowly. Part of me wanted to protect her again. But protection built on lies had nearly destroyed us. Yes. Her face crumpled immediately. I had no idea. I made sure you didn't. Why? The question almost broke my heart. Because she genuinely didn't understand. Because you were 20 years old, I said softly. And your father was dying. Tears rolled down her cheeks again. I should have helped. You were grieving too. No. Lauren shook her head quickly. Not just then. After. All these years. I remained silent. Because she was finally beginning to understand the real damage. Not financial damage. Moral damage. The slow erosion of empathy that happens when someone becomes too accustomed to being rescued. Lauren wiped her eyes again. I became horrible. I wanted to deny it automatically. That's what mothers do. We soften truths to protect our children. But softening truth was part of how we ended up here. So instead, I said quietly, you became someone willing to trade kindness for approval. The sentence hurt her physically. I could see it. Good. Some pain is necessary. Lauren stared at me helplessly. I don't know when it happened. I think you do. She looked down immediately. And suddenly I remembered all those tiny moments over the years. Lauren criticizing my clothes, correcting my speech, looking embarrassed by my house. The signs had always existed. We just both ignored them for different reasons. Lauren whispered I was ashamed. The honesty stunned me. Ashamed. Not angry, not manipulated. Ashamed of what I asked carefully. She laughed weakly through tears. Everything. Her voice cracked. Your clothes. Your car. Your house. The way you talked sometimes. Every word hurt. But I forced myself to listen. Because healing without honesty is just performance. Lauren pressed trembling fingers against her forehead. Diane made me feel like none of it was enough. Like I'd never belong unless I changed everything about myself. And eventually I said quietly, you started believing I embarrassed you. Lauren nodded while crying harder. I hated myself for thinking it. But you kept thinking it. Yes. The room fell silent again. Then she whispered the sentence I think she feared most. When I said she was more woman than you, I knew it would destroy you. The honesty hit like a knife, because until that moment, some small part of me still hoped she spoke impulsively, emotionally, without understanding. But she had known. Lauren looked sick after admitting it. I wanted to hurt you because I thought you were judging my life. I stared at her quietly. I was worried about your life. I know that now. No defensiveness remained in her voice anymore. Only grief. Real grief. For the first time, I saw my daughter mourning the person she had become. She looked around the house slowly then. At the faded curtains. The old family photographs. Michael's recliner. This place used to feel safe, she whispered. It still could. Lauren looked at me hopefully for half a second. Then I continued softly, but not if we pretend none of this happened. The hope faded into understanding. Good, because I was done pretending. She nodded slowly. I'll withdraw the guardianship petition. You should. I'll tell Diane never to contact you again. I said nothing. Lauren's voice became smaller. I know sorry isn't enough. No, it wasn't. Not even close. Because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. One can return long before the other. I folded my hands carefully together. Lauren, do you understand what hurt me most? She shook her head weakly. It wasn't the money, I said quietly. It wasn't even the cabin. Tears filled her eyes again. It was realizing my daughter could watch me suffer and still choose someone else's approval over my dignity. Lauren broke completely after that. She covered her face and sobbed openly at the kitchen table, while I sat across from her fighting tears of my own. Because despite everything, I still loved her. That was the tragedy of motherhood. Love survives even when trust doesn't. Eventually, Lauren looked up again with red, swollen eyes. What happens now? I thought about the question carefully before answering. Then finally I said the hardest thing I had ever told my child. That depends on whether you want your life to look impressive or honest. Lauren stared at me silently. And for the first time since she was a little girl, I think she truly listened. The first few weeks after the family meeting felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just unfamiliar. For years my life revolved around responding to other people's needs. Phone calls, financial emergencies, emotional crises, constant pressure disguised as family obligation. Then suddenly everything stopped. No desperate mortgage conversations, no tense dinners, no manipulative brunch invitations, just silence. At first the silence frightened me, then slowly it began healing me. Winter settled heavily over Ohio during those months. Snow covered the sidewalks outside my little brick house, while cold wind rattled the windows at night. I spent long evenings wrapped in blankets reading novels beside the fireplace Michael once insisted we didn't need. You can't trust Ohio winters, I had warned him back then. He built the fireplace anyway. He had been right. Some nights I still cried unexpectedly. Grief doesn't disappear simply because truth finally surfaces. In many ways, the truth creates a different kind of grief altogether. I grieved the daughter I thought I had. I grieved the version of myself who believed endless sacrifice guaranteed love. And most painfully of all, I grieved the years Lauren and I lost while trying to impress people who would never truly value either of us. But little by little, life started changing. Not dramatically, quietly. I began sleeping through the night again. I started cooking proper meals instead of surviving on coffee and anxiety. I finally scheduled the cardiac tests I postponed years earlier. The results showed mild issues that thankfully remained treatable. When Dr. Wallace asked why I had delayed care so long, I almost told him the truth. Because I spent years treating myself like an emergency fund instead of a human being. Meanwhile, Lauren disappeared from Diane Whitaker's social circle almost completely. I learned this gradually through short conversations with Ryan and occasional updates from Abigail, who still monitored the guardianship withdrawal paperwork carefully. Apparently, Diane was furious after the confrontation at my house. Not remorseful, furious. She blamed everyone except herself for the financial disaster unfolding around her. Several investment accounts collapsed shortly afterward, and rumors began spreading quietly through her country club community about debt issues and legal pressure. I felt no satisfaction hearing any of it, just exhaustion, because people like Diane rarely change. They simply run out of people willing to believe them. Lauren changed, or at least she started trying to. That matters more than people realize. Real change usually begins awkwardly, uncomfortably, without dramatic speeches. The first sign came 6 weeks after our confrontation. A handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox. Not a text, not an email, a real letter. I recognized Lauren's handwriting immediately. For almost 10 minutes, I simply stared at the envelope sitting on my kitchen table. Then finally, I opened it. Inside were 4 pages written carefully in blue ink. No excuses, no blame, no requests for money, just honesty. Lauren wrote about therapy, about realizing how deeply validation controlled her choices, about understanding for the first time that Diane's approval always depended on performance, while my love had asked for nothing except kindness. One paragraph made me cry harder than the others. I used to think successful people never needed anyone. But now I think the strongest people are the ones who love without making others earn it. Dad did that. You did too. I just didn't appreciate it until I became someone I couldn't recognize anymore. By the end of the letter, my hands were shaking. Then came the final paragraph. I don't expect forgiveness quickly. Maybe I don't deserve it at all right now. But I want to become someone Dad would still recognize. Someone you don't have to rescue anymore. If you ever decide there's room for me in your life again, I'll spend the rest of mine being grateful for it. No manipulation, no guilt, just humility. And strangely enough, that hurt more than anger ever did. Because now I could finally see the daughter I raised struggling to come back to herself. I folded the letter carefully and carried it into the living room where snow drifted softly outside the windows. Michael's photograph sat beside the fireplace as always. I looked at him for a long time. "You'd know what to do," I whispered. Of course he didn't answer, but somehow I already knew the truth. Healing doesn't happen through punishment. It happens through boundaries and honesty. 2 things I had avoided most of my life. 3 days later, I drove north to the lake cabin alone. The roads were icy and nearly empty that time of year. Bare trees lined the highway while pale winter sunlight reflected across frozen patches of snow. The moment I unlocked the cabin door, memories hit me all at once. The scent of old wood, the soft creaking floorboards, Michael's fishing gear still hanging near the back wall. This place had always been sacred to me. Not because it was valuable, because it was real. No performances lived here, no social climbing, no pretending. Michael built this cabin with his own hands because he believed peace mattered more than appearances. I finally understood him now in ways I never had before. That evening, I sat wrapped in a blanket beside the fireplace, rereading Lauren's letter while snow fell silently outside the lake windows. Then I made a decision. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. The next morning, I mailed a short handwritten note back to Lauren. Just 1 page. I invited her to the cabin for the weekend. Nothing more. No emotional promises. No dramatic reconciliation. Just an invitation. When Lauren arrived 2 days later, I barely recognized her at first. Not physically, emotionally. She drove herself instead of arriving in one of Ryan's luxury vehicles. She wore jeans, winter boots, and an old wool coat I remembered buying her years ago during a Christmas shopping trip. No designer armor, no performance. Just Lauren. She stepped out into the snow looking terrified. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she spoke quietly. "Hi, Mom." The words sounded fragile, like something easily breakable. "Hi," I answered. She looked toward the cabin slowly. "I haven't been here since Dad." Her voice cracked before finishing the sentence. "I know." Silence settled between us while cold wind swept across the frozen lake. Finally, Lauren looked back at me with tears already filling her eyes. I almost lost this place too, didn't I? I thought about the question carefully, then answered honestly. Yes. Lauren nodded slowly like she deserved the truth. Because she did. For a long moment, we simply stood there facing each other in the snow, surrounded by years of memory and pain and unfinished healing. Then quietly, cautiously, I stepped aside and opened the cabin door wider. "Come inside," I said softly. And for the first time in a very long time, my daughter came home without asking for anything. The first night at the cabin felt awkward in the gentlest possible way. Not hostile, not cold, just careful. Like two people walking barefoot through broken glass, trying not to reopen wounds that had barely started healing. Lauren offered to cook dinner almost immediately after arriving. I nearly said no out of habit. For most of her adult life, I had automatically taken care of everything whenever she visited. Meals, dishes, laundry, emotional comfort. I thought motherhood meant constant giving. Now I understood that love without boundaries eventually teaches people to stop noticing your exhaustion. So instead of refusing, I simply nodded. "All right," I said. "The soup ingredients are in the kitchen." Lauren smiled faintly. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from her in months. We moved around the small cabin kitchen quietly together, while snow drifted outside the windows. The old floorboards creaked beneath our feet exactly the way they had when Lauren was a little girl, helping Michael make pancakes on snowy mornings. At one point, she opened the wrong cabinet automatically, then stopped and laughed softly through tears. "Dad never moved anything in this kitchen." "No," I smiled, gently. "He said people should always know where comfort lives." That nearly made her cry again. Grief sat with us all evening. Not sharp grief anymore. Softer. Like an old scar aching during cold weather. After dinner, we sat beside the fireplace wrapped in blankets while logs crackled softly nearby. The cabin glowed with warm amber light, while the frozen lake stretched silently beyond the windows. Lauren stared into the fire for a long time before speaking. "I used to think success looked like Diane Whitaker." I stayed quiet. Perfect clothes, perfect house, perfect friends. She swallowed hard. Everything expensive. Everything polished. She laughed weakly. I spent years trying to become someone who looked impressive enough to belong beside her. And now, I asked softly. Lauren's eyes filled slowly with tears. Now I think she was the loneliest person I've ever met. The honesty in her voice hurt beautifully somehow, because she finally understood. People who build identities entirely around status eventually become emotionally homeless. Nothing is ever enough because appearances constantly require feeding. I watched the fire carefully before answering. "Your father used to say people obsessed with looking important usually feel invisible inside." Lauren smiled sadly. "That sounds exactly like him." We fell quiet again. Then suddenly Lauren whispered, "I forgot who loved me before I had anything." The sentence shattered something inside me. Because beneath all the betrayal and manipulation and pain, that was the real tragedy. My daughter lost herself trying to earn love from people who only valued performance while overlooking the people who loved her freely from the beginning. Lauren wiped tears from her cheeks. "I think part of me became embarrassed by kindness," she admitted quietly. Diane made softness sound weak. "And eventually, I started believing her." I nodded slowly. Cruel people often confuse fear with respect. Lauren stared into the flames. "I hurt you because I thought becoming harder would make me stronger." Her voice cracked again. "But I just became cruel." I looked at my daughter carefully then. Really looked at her. Not the polished woman from the steakhouse. Not the ashamed woman from my dining room weeks earlier. Just Lauren. Human, flawed, trying. And suddenly, I realized something important. She was no longer asking me to erase the past. She was finally willing to face it. That changes everything. I reached over slowly and placed my hand on top of hers. Lauren broke down instantly. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from relief mixed with grief. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she whispered through tears. "Not just for the dinner, for all of it." I squeezed her hand gently. I know. That was the truth. I did know now. Not because excuses erase the damage, because accountability changes people. For several minutes she simply cried while I sat beside her, listening to the fire crackle softly in the darkness. Eventually, she looked up again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why didn't you hate me?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully before answering. Because love doesn't disappear just because trust does. Lauren cried harder after that. And honestly, so did I. Because motherhood is complicated in ways people rarely talk about honestly. Sometimes your children hurt you deeply. Sometimes they disappoint you. Sometimes they become strangers for a while. But the love itself remains stubbornly alive beneath everything else. That doesn't mean you tolerate abuse. It doesn't mean you surrender your dignity. It just means love survives longer than pride. Later that night, after Lauren went upstairs to bed, I stayed awake alone beside the fireplace thinking about Michael. I could almost hear him laughing softly at the way life unfolded sometimes. All those years I believed protecting my daughter meant shielding her from pain. But pain was exactly what finally brought her back to herself. The next morning, sunlight reflected brilliantly across the frozen lake, while Lauren and I drank coffee together on the porch, wrapped in heavy coats. The world looked clean after fresh snow. Quiet, hopeful. Lauren glanced toward me nervously. "There's something else I need to tell you." I waited. "Ryan and I are selling the house." That surprised me slightly. "The mortgage is impossible now without your help," she admitted honestly. "And honestly, I don't want that life anymore. No bitterness, no blame, just acceptance." I nodded slowly. "What about you and Ryan?" Lauren stared out at the lake. "We're trying. Trying." That seemed honest too. Marriage survives many things, but only if both people stop pretending. After breakfast, I asked Lauren to walk with me down toward the dock despite the cold. Snow crunched beneath our boots, while frozen branches glittered overhead. When we reached the edge of the lake, I stopped. "There's something I need you to understand moving forward," I said gently. Lauren looked nervous immediately. "I forgive you." Fresh tears filled her eyes. But forgiveness does not mean everything returns to the way it was. She nodded slowly. "I know. I won't finance your life anymore. I understand. I won't sacrifice my health or peace trying to rescue you from consequences." More tears slipped down her cheeks. "I know." I studied her carefully. "And I need you to build a life based on honesty, not appearances." Lauren took a shaky breath. "I want that too." For the first time, I believed her. Then I told her something else. Something I had finalized with Abigail only days earlier. The majority of my estate is going into a scholarship foundation. Lauren blinked in surprise. What kind of foundation? One for older women returning to school after life interrupted their education. Her eyes widened. "Mom, I spent decades watching women abandon dreams to take care of everyone else," I said softly. "I want part of my life to help change that." Lauren smiled through tears. And what mattered most? She never once asked how much money remained for her. Not once. That's how I knew she was finally changing. As the sun slowly rose higher over the frozen lake, Lauren slipped her arm gently through mine the same way she used to when she was young. And standing there beside the water, Michael loved so much. I finally understood something that took me nearly 70 years to learn. Real love does not demand your destruction. Real love leaves room for dignity, for boundaries, for truth. And sometimes the strongest thing a mother can do is stop proving her love through suffering. Lauren leaned her head softly against my shoulder. "I love you, Mom." I closed my eyes briefly against the cold wind. Then finally, I answered with peace instead of pain. I love you too. After everything that happened, I spent a long time thinking about what this story truly meant. At first, I believed it was about betrayal. Then I thought it was about money manipulation or toxic family dynamics. But in the end, I realized it was really about something much deeper: self-worth. Many women spend their entire lives proving love through sacrifice. We give until we are exhausted. We forgive until we disappear. We stay silent because we believe keeping the family together matters more than protecting our own dignity. But love without boundaries is not healthy love. And kindness should never require humiliation. For years, I thought being a good mother meant always saying yes, always rescuing, always understanding. But real love also requires honesty. It requires accountability. It requires teaching people that they cannot wound you repeatedly and still expect unlimited access to your heart. What happened with Lauren broke me for a while, but strangely enough, it also saved me. Because losing my daughter's approval forced me to rediscover my own voice. And once I stopped chasing acceptance from people who only valued what I could give them, I finally found peace. If you are watching this while carrying pain from your own family, please remember this. You are allowed to love people and still protect yourself. You are allowed to forgive without surrendering your boundaries. And you are never less valuable simply because you are kind, aging ordinary, or soft-hearted. Sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest souls. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between love and self-respect? Do you believe family relationships can truly heal after betrayal? I would genuinely love to hear your story. And if you enjoy emotional family dramas like this, please subscribe, and join me again for the next story.